Hello and welcome to Freedom from Fear, a German New Medicine podcast. I'm your host, Ashlee Newberry.
And I'm your other host, Abigail Puccioni. Please be aware that nothing discussed here on this podcast should be taken as medical advice.
Consult your trusted professionals and your own inner knowing before making any health decisions. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Freedom from Fear. Today, we will be covering menstrual cycles, female conflicts, and looking at femininity through the lens of biology.
So today, we're thrilled to welcome Natasha Nazerali, a GNM practitioner and educator who guides individuals to awaken their true power through spiritual and biological connections. Inspired by her holistic upbringing and the teaching of Dr. Hamer's 5 biological laws, Natasha is dedicated to helping others achieve total sovereignty and freedom over their health, reconnecting them with their divine nature. So welcome, Natasha. We're super excited to have you on.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here. And I just want to give a huge shout out to Abigail and Ashlee for the amazing work that they're doing on this podcast, because I had the honor to meet you two in person in LA. And it's so fun for me to be able to connect with other young women who are doing this work, because I was raised on this work. So for so many years of my life, I was solo and nobody knew about GNM or what it meant. So it's such a blessing to have people use their platforms to speak about it. And it makes people like me feel a little less alone. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just a little bit of background to go a little further into it, because Abigail gave such a beautiful introduction. But yes, I was raised on this work. My mother studied German New Medicine around 15 years ago with many different educators that are still teaching today. And for her, it just really hit home as truth, and it became a passion. So I never learned German medicine from a book or a class or a workshop. I did those later on, but I learned German medicine through my own experience and through really becoming aware of the signals and the messages of the symptoms in my body. And I had a mom who would point them out to me. So she had the bird's eye view in raising me of seeing, oh, she just went through that experience and now she has that symptom. So anytime something would come up in my body, she would ask me, what did you just go through? Or what were you thinking about just before that occurred? Or isn't that funny that you just went through this and now you have this? And then as I grew up, I sort of looked things up with her as I went along, or I was in college calling my mom, being like, Mom, my roommate has this. What does it mean in GNM? So it was an interesting upbringing for sure. And now I feel honored to carry the torch and teach with her today. And we still teach together and host course programs and events together. But the niche that I've been so passionate about going into is femininity and womanhood. And what does it mean to be a woman in the natural biological world? And even my mom, when we sort of started to get more popular in our course programs and our events, we were really passionate about what can we do to educate women, because women will become mothers and mothers will raise their children just as I was raised. And how can we motivate them to learn about this paradigm? Because that's really how we create a revolution. And it's so amazing to see people like you who are GNM coaches, who are practitioners. But I also want to encourage people to just learn for their own health and for the health of their family. Yeah. So
Totally.
I think a great place to start in this conversation today would be to really hone in on what does it mean to be a woman through the lens of our biology. And we hear so much today about the divine feminine and to live in alignment with your femininity. And it's all really beautiful, but we can break it down in really simplistic, natural awareness. So, we look at the world today and we have like the archetype of the CEO or the go-getter. Or maybe we have the archetype of the woman who displays her sexual prowess and kind of exudes her femininity through sexuality, right? And then we might have the motherhood archetype. She's barefoot and pregnant, making sourdough in the kitchen, right? What does it all mean through the perspective of biology? And what German New Medicine taught us was something really beautiful, because just like we have the alpha male, we also have the alpha female. So through reading the brain scans, Dr. Hammer was able to determine that an alpha female has no conflicts in the temporal lobe. So what that means is when he scans the brain of the female, he would look at this area right above the ear called the temporal lobe. And there we have sexual conflicts and also territorial conflicts. And what he noticed was that when there were no Hammer foci in that brain area, that woman was biologically alpha. So let's take it back one step further, right? In nature. So let's say we're in a wolf pack or we're in a tribe. If we as women all get together, we're going to secrete through our sweat glands, and we're going to start to communicate on this sort of magical molecular pheromone level, and we're going to sync up our cycles. And why does that happen in nature? Well, it's so that if our cycles sync up, we ovulate at the same time, so that when the alpha male comes back to the tribe, he can impregnate us during ovulation and secure the line of the offspring, right? So this is actually a biological adaptation, you could say, or a biological truth that we have within us to ensure procreation, to ensure that there will always be a next generation and another offspring. So the alpha female was really, one could say, the most feminine one, because she had no traumatic conflict shocks that caused her to adapt. So she was living in harmony with nature. All right. So we don't play the shame or the blame game here. We know that we're living in an unbiological society. We know that there's barely anyone who's immune from experiencing conflict shocks, but it's just kind of important to not forget about this innate wisdom that we carry, because even to lose sight of the fact that us women are communicating through this invisible level is sacred. And so we don't want to forget that, okay? And it's beautiful to show our authenticity through all these different aspects of our femininity, but also important to come back to the truth of our womanhood and what an alpha female kind of means just through the perspective of biology. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I think that that is something that's probably very theoretical, but now in our modern world, I doubt that there is really an example of either a true alpha male or female. I would suspect that that's extremely rare, if not just rather impossible in today's society. Because I know that, I mean, I don't know. Do you know of any male or female that, has not experienced a territorial conflict?
Probably not. Not one that I have met.
No one I've met.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah, maybe a young child that's growing up really naturally, or maybe if we go, actually, maybe if I think about going to Guatemala and Atitlan, and they live very biologically there, and they still carry on all their Mayan traditions and live in a familial household, so probably they're quite
Yeah.
biological of those women, I'd say. But we'd have to see their brain scan to determine it,
Yes.
Yeah.
And just to ask a follow-up question for listeners that might not be aware of what a Hammer foci is, just to maybe explain a little bit about what the lesion is that shows up on a brain scan and what, I mean, not that we're going to dive into this topic fully, but just to kind of touch on briefly, like what these CT scans are that Dr. Hammer used in his research.
Right. So when we have a conflict shock, right? Maybe we get the phone call that we just lost our job, right? All of a sudden, we have something sudden, acute, dramatic, unexpected event, and immediately the body works synchronistically. So the psyche, the brain, and the organ are all working at the same time. And we go through what we call in this paradigm a DHS, right? A conflict shock, and it registers at the brain level. So how it registers is unique to the individual because it's all about the way the psyche perceives a situation.
Mhm.
So let's say I maybe got the news that my beloved pet just died, right? So I could perceive that as a loss conflict. And maybe for me, if that dog was like my baby, I might run an ovarian adaptation. And
Yeah.
if you scanned my brain scan, you would see that at the relay of the brain that controlled the ovaries, there would be a little Hammer focus. And he said, you can see it in images that we still have today. It looks like a little ring in the brain scan. And actually, Hammer went to Siemens, which was the manufacturer of the CT scans, and he
Mhm.
presented the data and the information, asking Siemens to say, is this like a technological normality? Like, is this something that's going on within the technology of Siemens, or is this something that's going on at the biological level? And Siemens actually verified that no, this isn't something that is these rings are not appearing as something that exists in their CT scan technology, but it is something that's actually happening at the biological level. So there are still amazing educators that are expanding on German new medicine by continuing to read the brain scans today. And I also want to mention that Hammer was very diligent in his studies. So he would always take something as 100%. So 100% of patients who had testicular cancer had a Hammer foci at the brain relay that controlled the testicles. And he went organ by organ this way. So that's what we mean when we talk about the Hammer foci. So what I just mentioned about the temporal lobe was that alpha female, she wouldn't have had any of those foci in her temporal lobe. And that way he could take data and ask questions to that alpha female, quote unquote alpha female, about her own biological experience and accumulate data from all the women that didn't have any conflicts in there. And he did this for the alpha male as well. Yeah. So
Okay.
I think a good place to kind of segue into that is, let's talk about that a little bit more, that temporal lobe. So when a woman experiences a sexual conflict, so that is, again, that DHS, that conflict shock, that all of a sudden, what is a sexual conflict? Well, really, a sexual conflict is an event or a dramatic shock that I've experienced that now jeopardizes my femininity. So it now makes me understand that to be a woman in the world is not safe. My femininity is not protected. And for women, this is really important. It's so, so sacred. And how many of us women have experienced situations where we don't feel safe as a woman? I mean, I think almost
All
all
the
of us,
time.
yeah. So it can even be as simple as we are a young child and our father walks out the door. that can be interpreted in the psyche as a sexual conflict because we're now fatherless, so we're not protected. The male biological role that is supposed to protect and provide for us is no longer there. So in nature, I know that we're modern day beautiful women, but we're still natural biological beings. So in nature, acute dramatic events like that can be interpreted as a sexual conflict. Likewise, we can be rejected by a man we really truly cared for, and that can be a sexual conflict, right? We can be maybe going out in the world and somebody makes a really inappropriate comment that makes us uncomfortable. That can be a sexual conflict, right? Or likewise, we can be with a partner who we don't see as the father of our children. Sexual conflict. We can be a modern day woman in the world who has to strive and fend for herself and nobody's there to help her. Sexual conflict. Yeah. So we go through this as women all the time. And what happens is it's registering at the brain level, and our body is responding in this really miraculous way. And it's saying, all right, we're not protected in our femininity. We have to go out into this world and fend for ourselves because there's nobody here to protect us. So, what we're going to do is we're going to adapt in a very biological manner and we're going to up testosterone. So, what happens is the sexual conflict registers at the brain level and estrogen goes down and testosterone goes up, right? So we're going to say, nope, we got to fend for ourselves. You got to be that CEO. You got to get that job. You got to hustle. And now we get a little higher in testosterone, right? And we can look at this when we examine the masculinization of women today.
Yep.
On the flip side, for the male, it's territorial loss. When the male loses his territory, he lowers testosterone and estrogen goes up, right? So when we're experiencing this phenomenon that we're witnessing is why are women becoming more masculine and why are men becoming more feminine? We can actually use our awareness of our biology to understand why that is. So I would encourage women to do some introspection. When did you feel like you lost your femininity? And if you're examining your own behavior and your own role or position in the world today, where have you lost sight of your femininity because you felt this obligation based on your own experience to quote unquote buck up or man up and deal with it? And how can you really come back to the truth of who you are?
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I think that
Something we lose sight of.
maybe you also perhaps want to touch on the topic of feminism. And I know that this will probably ruffle some feathers, but that's okay. So yeah, I guess what is your take on the movement of feminism and how this has contributed to some of the, well, even, infertility, right? And in addition to many other kind of female related symptoms that a lot of women are experiencing chronically.
Right. Well, I'll preface this by saying I went through my own bouts of feminism, right?
Oh, me
So,
too.
yeah, I know
Yeah.
we all
Same.
have. So,
Yeah.
what I'm saying is, of course, we're all equal, right? And we
Mhm.
deserve equal opportunity, but we are not the same. So that's where we enter the realm of biologically, physiologically, and psychologically, we are different as men and women. And so we have to start there. Yeah. And actually, when we come back to our more natural biological roots as women in the world, then we can still move through the world with our own free will and awareness. So knowing this work is not like, okay, now you got to stay home and feed your kids and make sourdough and wear frilly lily dresses. Like, if that's what you're interpreting from my message, then I'm sorry, but like you're misinterpreting what I'm saying. What I'm saying is actually it's important for us to understand where belief systems on society have superseded truth. Okay. So we
Yeah.
are still oppressed as women if we're forced to go out in the world and not be protected in our femininity. To me, that's still oppression, right? So even with what I do, I'm still moving with awareness, right? I'm still having a job and a career and living on my own. I'm also a single female. So all these things in nature would be totally unbiological, but I'm absolutely happy as a clam living my life that way. And I feel also very feminine in doing so. So it's just about understanding the awareness of it, right? So in nature, when we go through these conflicts, so to speak, we are in more of our masculine brain hemisphere, right? So it's about understanding that. And sometimes I like to use that archetype, right? So if we look at the archetype of that feminist, like rah, 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 I'm on the street and I'm demanding equal pay and all of this stuff, that's really good. And that's really beneficial. But would we say that's more of an estrogen driven trait or more of a testosterone driven trait, right? So we
Yeah.
would say more testosterone. So we would look at that and say, okay, that woman experienced something that made her not feel totally safe in her feminine. And
Yeah.
how can we examine those belief systems so that we can honor her to feel safe again? And how can she do the inner work to know, I actually deserve the right to be surrendered in my femininity. And that is my birthright. And one of the things I notice in this feminism movement today, and one of the things I notice with the clients that I work with that are females, because I really only work with female clients, is we've denied ourselves the birthright of claiming motherhood.
Mm,
So every cycle, every process that our body goes through as a woman, is to give life, is to ensure procreation. So we have a cycle, we have ovulation, right? We have all these hormonal changes, and it's all there to ensure this sacred act of us giving life. And so many of us have completely suppressed that inner knowingness, or we move throughout menstruation or menopause like it's nothing, like it's just something that we go through, like it's just some randomness that happens to us. We take away the sanctity of it, the purity of it. And in doing so, we've actually denied ourselves our birthright. So it is your birthright as a woman in this world to give life. So you are inherently put on this earth to be a mother. Whether you choose to be one or not is your own beautiful, majestic choice. But what you inherently are, the truth of who you are, is a mother. And your body is going through a daily process, everybody, a daily cyclical process for you to be a mother. So many of us women have lost sight of that, and we've denied ourselves that, the sanctity of motherhood, or we said, like, I'm going to get a career and I'm going to get this. And that's so beautiful. But we need to do that with awareness. And if we deny ourselves this sacred, honorable, real birthright that we have, it's kind of like we immediately take away our femininity right from there.
hmm. So, what would you say to someone listening or one of your clients um, that, doesn't want to have kids, but they also want to resolve some of these conflicts? Like, what would you say to them?
Right. So let's explore that. So, first of all, I would kind of go into looking at the cervical conflict. So the cervix is a sexual frustration conflict, and that has been so misinterpreted in the community. So let's break it down. Like, I have the fun childhood environment of being raised by my German mother. So I speak German, right? So when Dr. Hammer was going through the codification of these conflicts, he had to look at naming them in a way that would apply in nature as well. So, testicular cancer in the male has to also be the same adaptive nature as testicular cancer in my dog, so to speak. So, the reason why the biological function of why a man would get testicular cancer, right? Why the cells in the testicles would proliferate in the male have to be the same reason and biological function as why the cells would proliferate in my dog, right? So that's why things are named like a territorial loss conflict or a procreation implantation conflict. And so many people have misconstrued that to just say like, oh, well, GNM doesn't work for me because I don't understand that. I didn't have that kind of conflict. It's like, no, you don't understand what the terminology actually means and why it was codified in that way. So let's look at it through examining the cervix. So the cervix, he called a sexual frustration conflict. But with awareness and with speaking through other GNM educators who are reading the brain scans, we could also say it's a procreation conflict. So it's anywhere that a female wouldn't feel safe to procreate. So this is really fascinating because one of the educators who we've all worked with, who reads the brain scans today, he noticed that every single female has a Hummer focus in the relay that controlled the cervix, meaning every female was running a sexual frustration conflict, every single female. So that means a female who didn't belong to a man, so who didn't have a partner. She had this Hummer foci in the relay of her brain that controlled the cervix. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating when you think about it.
Yeah.
Likewise, he then examined young female children who were fatherless, and he also found that they had a relay in the brain and a Hummer focus at the cervix. So they also had this sexual frustration. And he wondered why. Why would a female who's fatherless have this sexual frustration conflict? And then he realized, oh, yeah, it makes sense because in nature, if I don't have that fatherly figure to protect and provide, is it really safe for me to procreate? Because who's going to take care of my offspring, right? Likewise, if I'm a single female in nature and I'm maybe casually dating and I am with a man who I could totally not see as the father of my children, and I think about him and I'm like, oh my gosh, no, he's way too immature. He is not equipped to be a father. I could never see him as the father of my children. Do you think that could be a procreation conflict? Do you think in that circumstance, I would be safe, quote unquote, in nature to give life? Probably not. Likewise, if I'm a single female and I have to fend for myself and I'm hustling and I'm trying to make money and I'm living on my own, is it really safe for me in nature to give life? No. So we go through these nuances of biological conflicts, right? That's why we say everything in German new medicine is psychobiological. And I'm a single female living in the world today. So do I have this cervical conflict? You bet I do. And one of the ways for sure I do is I track my cycle, right? So if we go back to the alpha female in nature, when Dr. Hammer studied the data on that alpha female, so the one who had no conflicts in the temporal lobe, he found she had a harmonious cycle of 28 days. All right. And this is really beautiful because even the cycle of the moon in nature goes through a phase of 28 days. So wouldn't it make sense that if we're looking at nature, that we would follow the cycles of nature as women? Yeah, it would. So doesn't that remind you of the miracle of who we are as female beings? Like, it's absolutely insane. So I personally have a cycle of 33 days. Okay. So what does that mean? It means that I'm running a program in the cervix. So what my body is telling me is that I too am going through a sexual frustration or a procreation conflict. And guess what? I belong to no man. I haven't found that amazing, masculine, radical, awake, biological man out there in society, right? So in the meantime, I have to fend for myself, okay? But what's happening is my body is going to respond in this really amazing adaptive way to actually help me and help me facilitate in overcoming this problem, so to speak. So what happens is the cervix in conflict activity, cells in my cervix ulcerate. So what is happening is in this conflict of, oh my God, am I ever going to find this man? And will I ever have babies? And will I ever be pregnant? Right? That's a conflict for so many women today. What
Yeah.
happens is my body goes, let's help her in this conflict. So cells in my cervix ulcerate, causing my cervix to widen so that I can better have the sperm travel up my cervical canal and fertilize the egg. So that's the organ job of the cervix. It's like this spiritual portal that sucks up sperm to fertilize my egg. So if the cells in my cervix widen, what's actually happening is I have a biological adaptation that's helping to bring the sperm to my egg so I can give life that month. So what's really going on is my body is saying, okay, Natasha's having this conflict. So let's make sure that if she has sex this month, she's going to have a real good chance of having a baby. All right. And we as modern day women were like, what? We're like, that sounds silly and stupid and totally not feminism. But I'm sorry to tell you, your biology is working this way. Your biology as a female is just doing what it can to get you knocked out. All right? That's wonderful. So when you think about it. So that's happening in conflict activity. And then if you remember in our two-phase program, it's like as above, so below. What goes up must come down. As within, so without. So in accordance to the intensity of how intense that conflict was for me, in the healing phase, all of those cells that were ulcerated in conflict activity need to be replenished, right? So that's why when we have cellular proliferation, fungi, microbes, bacteria that come to restore, regenerate, and replenish the tissues of the cervix. And so in actuality, what allopathic medicine doesn't acknowledge is that for females, the cervical tissue is changing all the darn time, okay? So you're getting your pap smear or you're checking for this. And we're kind of like, we would look at it in our paradigm like, yeah, depending on when you take the test, it could indicate many different factors in your cervix. And actually, as women in society today, most of us are running the program. So you
Yeah.
probably are having tissue change, right? And by the way, I want to mention for those listening, it's the cervix organ. So that same conflict, cervical cancer, is the same sexual frustration, procreation conflict, right? And on the minor level, the organ is adapting and the tissues are constantly shifting. So when you look at something like menstrual pain, what's happening when the tissues are adapting in that way is through cellular ulceration and then proliferation, the cervix gets very sensitive. So that means that when our cycle comes, we can experience menstrual pain because the cervix is now sensitive through ulceration and proliferation. So even me, myself, I might have a little bit more sensitivity in my cycle because I know, oh, it's 33 days. I have the cervical program. I have a sexual frustration. So when my cycle comes, it's a little sensitive. And it's even so accurate and brilliant that I can even track it of like, oh my God, if that month I met a guy and I thought, oh, maybe that's the man. Maybe he's the one. And then it didn't work out. It's like, oh, that period that month is like, oh, a little extra painful. Just remind
Mm-hmm.
like, yep, you didn't find the father of your children just yet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
So going back to Ashlee's question before with women who, and we'll get to infertility in a minute, but with women who just don't have a desire for children, maybe do want to focus on their career or just, yeah, don't want to have kids, or at least not yet, because you have a lot of younger women who maybe don't want kids yet. And maybe that changes when they get older, maybe not. But since so many women are likely running this program, what changes between women who are running this program who I know that there are some that do want to be pregnant and then some that don't. So if you could kind of touch on that. And then also, if you don't want to be pregnant, but then your body does, and your body's like trying to help you get pregnant. I think yeah, culturally that's a bit hard to understand, especially when we talk about like young girls, like children who experience sexual frustration conflicts, like for example, with the father, being out of the picture, or, you see this a lot with, divorce and stuff like that. But I guess some people might think that that's a bit weird to hear about, like a young child having like a sexual frustration, procreation conflict, when even biologically there's no way at that age that she could get pregnant before puberty. So if you could just touch on that a little, that would be great.
Great. So a great way to sort of start on that subject would be, so you could know, right? Just like you were saying in your question, you could know even whether a female was experiencing sexual frustration by asking her if she's interested in having children. Now, I want to sort of specify and let everybody know, you can not want to have children based off your own choice and based off your current circumstance, right? And that is totally valid and beautiful and perfect for you. What I'm talking about here is you might be working with a female, because I know a lot of listeners are health practitioners, or they're in this field, or they're wanting to understand their own biology on a deeper level, right? So if you have experienced that you have absolutely no interest in having children, all right? That is when I would know that there's a conflict. So if you're like, oh no, the thought of it kind of like freaks me out, or you have an intense reaction, or you have an intense non-reaction, right? No interest at all. That tells me there's something there. Why? Because biologically, we as women are actually biologically wired to have a desire to procreate,
Mm-hmm.
and like a hormonal desire as well to nurture and take care of a baby, right? We release oxytocin. We're all about relationship. So at the biological level, if there's a complete dissonance, disinterest, or even an intense reaction, or like real I don't want to, and the thought of it really freaks me out. Okay, I know. Okay, we have something there. So I can explore that with somebody and say, okay, where did you go through conflicts in your
Mm-hmm.
life that made it so in your experience it's no longer biologically safe, right? Because in GNM, we always look at what problem does the adaptation solve? So if
Yep.
there's a woman out there in the world who's like, oh, no, I don't want to have kids at all, that's terrifying to me. Well, that behavior is an adaptation. It solves a problem off of an experience or a trauma that she might have had where she thought, whoa, it is totally not safe for me to be a mother. And the more I can work with her in resolving that, the more she can actually come back into her femininity. And then she can still, through her own awareness and her own circumstance, choose not to have children. And that would be beautiful as well. It's just she shouldn't deny her biology right off the bat. See, there's like a nuance in the
Yeah,
difference of that. And a great
totally.
place to start when you're looking at how do I reconnect with my femininity and how do I understand if I myself maybe experienced sexual conflicts from a young age or in my childhood would be to look at your menarche. So your menarche is the first occurrence of menstruation. So you can have a think to yourself, ah, do I remember the age at which my period first occurred? So when we think back to that alpha female that we've been talking about, the one with no conflicts in her temporal lobe, what we found in the data of GNM is that she goes through her period at the biological age of 11. So Hammer was able to determine the biological age of menstruation to be 11 years old. So this is really brilliant data we can work off of because now I know, okay, so if I add my period after the age of 11 or before the age of 11, then I know I had a conflict. This is brilliant. So the right-handed female, when she experiences a sexual conflict, right? So that's anything that she experienced that made her go, no, it's not safe for me to be a woman in the world. It's not safe for me to be in my femininity. The biology does something super wise. It adapts, estrogen goes down, testosterone goes up. So now if I am a female and I'm lower in estrogen, higher in testosterone, I won't get my period, right? My menarche, my first occurrence of menstruation will then be delayed. Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
usually what happens is the female can either resolve that initial sexual conflict or she'll have a secondary conflict. So she'll have a territorial loss, which will fall on the opposing brain hemisphere. And then estrogen will go back up again and she'll get her period, right? And that's getting a little bit more advanced. But generally speaking, for the right-handed female, it's the sexual conflict that makes her estrogen go down and testosterone go up. Yeah. And for the left-handed female, she runs opposite, right? The left-hander is like that double feminine, right? She has two sexual conflicts. So for her, it's the sexual conflict that causes estrogen to go up, and then maybe she might ovulate early. And so she might have menstruation or the menarche at an earlier age. So really, this is how accurate we can get. And we can use the information of our cycle to tell us what programs we're running. And I'm sure you guys in many later episodes will get much deeper into constellations and explore that. But
Yeah.
generally speaking, if you had a period that was delayed or early, we're looking at sexual conflicts and territorial conflicts, or for the left-handed female, we're looking at two sexual conflicts. Yeah?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So what if someone, okay, so I have a question about the age part. So what if someone has their period at age 11? Does
Amazing.
that mean does so that was me actually. Apparently that's really
Too.
amazing.
Yeah, me too.
But as a right-handed female, does that mean I could have actually had it at like the normal biological age because I was in constellation?
Yeah, but then you would have had to have like the two conflicts that year of 11.
Okay,
You
interesting.
understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because the constellation, if you entered it, if you had the sexual conflict and the territorial loss at like 8, then you would have gotten your period at 8. And
Right.
actually, wait, this is actually important to talk about because I've been reading some articles lately on data in allopathic medicine that is showing that children are actually statistically having early menarche. So this is a phenomenon that
Yeah.
doctors are documenting that females are getting their periods as young as 8, and they
Yep.
don't understand why. So they're attributing it to environment, maybe hormones in the food. But actually, if you know German New Medicine, it makes total sense, because for the right-handed female, it's a constellation, right? So that means she has a sexual conflict and a territorial loss conflict. So maybe it could be a sexual conflict as, oh, dad walks out the door, right? My parents split up, and now I have a territorial loss because I have to split time in between two homes. So that could create
Mm,
a constellation for me, right? That's an example of a sexual conflict and a territorial loss. And maybe if I experience both of those situations at the age of 8 years old, all of a sudden I get my period, right? So
yeah.
this is a phenomenon that's been happening. And we, if we know German New Medicine, we know what it means is, well, yeah, we're living in a very unbiological world where children are going through conflicts like they
Mhm.
never had before. Even think about a child going on their iPhone and seeing something inappropriate as a sexual conflict, right? So how
Yep.
often can that happen? Or a child going into school and learning something about sex. Okay, this is
Before
all
they're ready.
before they're ready. So now that we know that the biological age is 11 for the female, that means that when we're raising our children, we can teach them about more awareness of how biology works and how procreation works when we teach it in age of their puberty, right? So if we're teaching this sort of awareness when they're actually going through puberty at 11, so when they have the biological awareness to understand it, then that's great. But actually, if we're teaching it before the age that they have the biological awareness to understand it, that's when we step into the arena of we can be creating real conflicts and real triggers for that child, which we don't want to do, right? We don't want anybody to view sex or their relationship with sex as a conflict, yeah? Because that's never a good idea in nature. So that's really interesting to look at when we're examining this phenomenon that's happening in our society today, that children are getting their menarche before the sort of biological alpha age, if you want to say, right? And I think another thing that's really important to note is all the studies that were done on menstruation. So all the studies that allopathy has based their data on was actually conducted by men who studied orphaned children. All right. So
Wow.
when the first studies of menstruation came out, the individuals that they were studying that they had access to were children in orphanages. And that's what they used to determine the sort of median average age of menstruation. And how conflicted do you think orphan children must have been? Right. So
Yeah.
we're not looking at this naturally. And this is what's really important. This is our responsibility as women to really examine our menstruation. And the truth is, our ancestors did this for centuries. You know, I had the real privilege of going to Guatemala to the sacred lake of Atitlan and studying with the Mayan abuelas on their traditions of female biology and femininity. And they live in alignment with the cycles of menstruation and nature. So they build their temazcals, which are the symbolic representation of the womb, and they build an altar to Mother Earth. They also wear the faja, which is a sacred cloth that they wrap around their wombs in accordance with their cycles. So they are carrying this ancestral wisdom.
Mm.
And this is what's really beautiful about German New Medicine is it's just a sort of scientific codification of what our ancestors already knew to be true. And really, this was the wisdom our mothers should have taught us. Yeah. Um, and so it's even not as simple as just get off your birth control, which is important too, right? So if you're listening to this, I am not giving you any medical advice, but if you currently have an IUD or you're currently on the birth control pill, I would really rethink that. Because there's no biological reason for you to do it. You can track your cycles like our ancestors have been doing for centuries, and you can live in alignment with your cyclical nature as a woman and plan or prevent pregnancy that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I'm talking everybody's ear off, but I really could like talk about this all day, every day, you know?
No,
Yeah.
I feel like in my head right now, there's so many different follow-up questions I want to ask. And I'm like, what
Same.
direction to go in right now? Because
Yeah.
I mean, you're bringing up so many great points. And I think that this is stuff that needs to be talked about. And also to highlight the fact that, we're talking about what is biological. We're viewing things from the perspective of biology as in our primal nature, looking at, the history of our human development, right? And sometimes confronting this can be a little uncomfortable, but I think it's also good to keep in mind that when we're talking about, this is the biological purpose, this is like what our biology is doing for us. Biological and unbiological is not synonymous with good and bad or,
Yeah.
right and wrong. Like I think that some people that uh, are in the GNM realm, at least from things that I've heard or people I've talked with, people can fall into making this a bit of a religion almost and viewing things in this sense of religious dichotomy. Uh, and thinking through things of like, oh yeah, good, evil, in this kind of very black and white view of things. But when we're talking about, biological reality, like, look, it is in your biological nature to do everything for the purpose of reproduction, essentially. Like
Yeah.
that is true. But also, it's not wrong if you don't want kids, right? Or choose not to have kids, or choose to pursue a career. Like, and I like the nuance that you brought to this conversation. That that is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. This is not like a moral judgment. But when you're looking at different, chronic symptoms and chronic conflicts in your life, this is where it, originated. And like you were saying, going back to, feeling safe as a woman, feeling safe to reproduce, whether you choose to or not, that's ultimately what it goes back to. And also, this isn't about the blame game, blaming, your parents that got divorced or, blaming, whatever situations, but rather to use this as a tool to cultivate deeper awareness, which I know you highlighted several times. And also a little tidbit that I remember. I know that this is from some research study that they did on cervical cancer, that actually the rate of cervical cancer is like extremely small, if almost like non-existent in cultures. I don't know exactly
It
what
was the Middle East.
country. Yeah, somewhere in the Middle
Yeah.
East where arranged marriages are very common. And
Oh,
again,
yes.
I
Yes.
don't want anyone to think that I'm saying that I support arranged marriages or that I think that's a great idea or that I support anything like that. Okay. So make that very clear. But in cultures where they had arranged marriages, where girls knew, okay, this is who I, belong to. I feel like so many people are going to misconstrue this, but this is okay. That, this is my mate, right? When the mate was chosen for them, they had extremely small, if not non-existent rates of like cervical cancer.
Right.
Do you know that study I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I do.
Okay. Yeah.
And I interpret it in through the same lens, through
Yeah.
talking about German new medicine. So might be interesting because we've been talking about the cervix, and so you'll know that based off of tracking your cycle, right? Above 28 days. So now maybe we could even get into, all right, what if it's less than 28 days, right?
Yeah.
So then we get into the ovaries, which is a loss conflict. And
Mhm.
how prevalent is that amongst women in society? So, loss conflicts can be the loss of a beloved animal, or the loss of a loved one, or even
Hmm.
an abortion or miscarriages, right? So, how often have women experienced that? So, you really want to resolve the loss conflict. If you're working with a female who has cycle less than 28 days, or if you yourself are experiencing this, examine where did you experience that loss conflict? I've worked with clients who have had ovarian programs because of a loss of a pet who they really dearly interpreted as their baby, so to speak, right? Or I've had people run ovarian programs when their grandmother died. Yeah, that can be a very intense loss for a lot of people. So that's a really common one too. And we as women, I feel we forget the significance of things like miscarriages or abortions, and we're so quick to write them off, right? So when we're looking at things like fertility, right, the more we resolve these conflicts associated with the organs, the more fertile we become. So
Yep.
we actually look at infertility. That's like the real specialty I love to work with my clients. You know, I've gotten some women pregnant and it's like, oh, I could die. Like my purpose in the world is done, right? Just by helping another woman bring life into this world. But really, when we look at it biologically, we can understand, oh, if I resolve these conflicts in my life, I'm actually living in more harmony with nature, and I'm coming back into my fertility. So I can be more fertile and create more offspring. So, yes, if your cycle is less than 28 days, then we want to be looking at ovarian programs or ovarian cysts, right? Those are really, really, really popular. And what happens is we often create tracks. So that same theme, that same trigger keeps coming up in our life, right? So as we're living in alignment with our cycles as women, it's really important to not only track the length of your cycle, but also track the symptoms of your cycle, right? So this is very odd amongst women's coaches that they've like normalized period pain. I'm kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum. I'm kind of like, okay, ladies, it's actually your birthright to have a harmonious cycle. And how great would it be if you actually got excited for it, right? So
Yep.
I'm sure you guys have talked about this on your podcast before, what a track is, right? So a
Yes.
track is almost like an allergy. It's like we associate a symptom with something. We never want to do that. Like I always say, you never want to see food as a threat, right? You never want to associate food as a trigger or associate it with a symptom. Likewise, you never want to associate the sacred female cycle with pain. All right. We don't want to normalize that. Yeah. Because it almost becomes a self-fulfilled prophecy. So let's go through
Yep.
it. Right. So we have the cervix. We talked about that sexual frustration that can cause sensitivity, right? That's a symptom of quote unquote PMS, right? Then we also have self-devaluation, right? I mean, if you experience that, back pain, right? We have that self-devaluation in resolution. The lower back can also be looked at as support, right? Where didn't I feel supported and now maybe I am? Or is it localized? Am I devaluing myself in that area? Am I going, oh, I have my period again. And when I have my period, I get so tired and then I can't work. And then when I can't work, I can't make money. Like all this devaluation that we associate, like, oh, when I'm on my period, I'm literally bedridden. I can't do anything. I have to just lie down. Well, you don't have to. Okay. Like we don't make the associations here. We want to liberate ourselves from these conflict triggers, right? So we want to start to get rid of triggers. Another thing we can look at is the uterus, right? So the uterus and the fallopian tubes, that's that procreation implantation. So for a lot of women, it can be, oh, I really, really tried to get pregnant this month. And again, it didn't happen, right? How many females experience that? So again, the adaptations that are running on the cellular level can also cause sensitivity and pain or PMS symptoms. Yeah. again, maybe you had an ugly conflict with the male. That's also associated with the uterus and fallopian tubes. So were you fighting with your partner that month? Or did you have a male boss that really berates you, right? So
Yep.
really interesting to track your symptoms. And when you have a month that's particularly more sensitive or painful than the one before, you can get really, really honed in on the messages and the signals of your biology to let you know, oh, what did you experience that month? And how did the organs adapt to your experience?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That cycle tracking is very key with understanding what's going on. And I really liked what you said about not associating the periods with pain. And that has been so normalized in all of our society, even like, right, a lot of women's coaches. It's like, well, that's just like within the range of normal. And it's like, well, maybe it's within the range of common, or like, it's been normalized, but on this biological level and what we're sharing on this podcast and this episode, it's like those symptoms are messages and specific ones to which organs are affected. And it's not random. And it's also, just because it's common doesn't mean that you have to keep experiencing it either, that it has to just become your normal, just because, the people around you all have very similar symptoms or whatnot. Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah. And I also, it's so funny because I know this stuff, right? Like I was raised on this stuff. I mean, like when I started my cycle, my mom, the first thing she ever said was, "You are absolutely never allowed to go on birth control, just so you know." Right? Like she was like really adamant on me just like being super biological and not denying myself my true nature of my biology by going on something like birth control, right? So she was very vocal, but it's funny because I guess I also just thought like, oh yeah, I'm not going to have any tracks or triggers with my cycle, but I wasn't really honoring it until I really got into my spiritual awakening, and then even less so. And then I was just like, oh yeah, my cycle comes, and yeah, I know it's a sexual frustration and I'm not 28 days, but I'm not with anybody or this year or something. So why track it? Why bother? Right. And then I had this sort of epiphany where I'm currently single, and I had a recent epiphany because I just thought, yeah, I know my things and I'm not really doing my diligence to track. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, what are you doing? Because if you want motherhood, if you want that person, and what if he like walks into your life tomorrow? Wouldn't you start to track your cycle? So if that's the case, why wouldn't you be doing it now? Like, why are you not honoring it just because you don't have a man in your life? Like, aren't you perpetuating that to some degree, right? And then I thought it was so silly of me because I'm like, here I am teaching about this. And then I was just kind of like, yeah, well, I'm not currently having that man in my life, so I'm not going to be so diligent about tracking or being aware or putting it on the calendar. And then I thought, well, that's kind of backwards, because if he were to show up today, I would. And if I were to be trying to have a baby today, I would. So again, isn't that an aspect of me denying that sacred right that I have, this sacred gift that's within me if I'm not tracking it? So yeah, then I was like, okay, now I better try.
Ooh, okay. So this
Yeah.
this this whole thing just got me really thinking about tracking. And
Yeah.
so if for you, let's just say, Natasha, right, you meet your man this coming week.
Yeah.
Even if you're not having sex with this man yet, but you can see him as the father of your children, would then your cycle automatically start to shift and decrease in length and go back to 28 days?
Absolutely, it could, right? Depending on how my psyche interpret it. And it was really interesting because so many women have shared with me so many different stories on meeting a man or having a relationship with a man, finally feeling safe with the man, and all of a sudden all these female reproductive symptoms resolve themselves, right? Why?
Mm,
Because she feels safe, right? But I would say to that degree also, you're totally right, Ashlee. I could meet him tomorrow and resolve a lot of things and notice many shifts, many changes. But I would say, let's take it one step further than that. And so if we're looking at it from the G&M perspective, we would say, oh, that's a practical solution, right? Like she met somebody and it practically resolved her conflicts because she felt safe and protected as a biological woman in the world. But in G&M, we also know that we have to have transcendent solutions. So
yeah.
in the transcendent nature of looking at the symptoms that are coming up in my reproductive health, I would have to claim radical responsibility of, the ways I'm still entering these tracks and triggers and denying myself of my femininity and coming into the sexual conflict. So we would still have to look at what belief systems are we still holding? What are the triggers that we still haven't resolved? Where have we still not forgiven ourselves? Right? All this stuff, we still need to do the work. And I would argue that if I were not to be surrendered in my femininity, that I would never meet the man anyway. I would never meet the masculine man that was truly my balanced mirror, right? So the more feminine I am, the more masculine man I will attract. So I won't meet him, one could argue, unless I really do my own inner work to resolve it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know? And I do
Totally.
say that to a lot of female clients that you have it backwards thinking like, oh, meet the divine masculine man and then I'll just wilt like a flower. It's like, no, you need to do the work first already to
Yeah.
even recognize that masculine man or be attracted to him. Even I work with a lot of female clients who have lost interest in the opposite sex altogether or lost interest in dating altogether. So that too would show me there's a conflict there, right? Because she has no interest, no libido, right? So that tells me something about her too.
Totally. And I think also for those ladies out there who are already in relationships, perhaps married, have kids, whatever, there's also a lot that can be said for when you're like what you're talking about with that transcendent resolution or perceptual resolution, when you're working towards, I mean, not like the guy doesn't have any responsibility, okay, but like when you're moving towards that, embodying more the feminine and working on those underlying conflicts, which many of which probably, originated in childhood, right? That actually will impact the masculinity of your man. So I know a lot of women who are showing up, and this is, what Dr. Sasha does, right, with the Freya course, with biological relations, between men and women, and what true biological femininity is.
Right.
And it's not a lot of what you might think it is, but when you're communicating in a more feminine way and when you're showing up to your relationship in a more feminine way, that actually does not just change you, but also the energetics of your current relationship. And so, I think the woman has a lot of power to kind of amplify the masculine that is perhaps like lying dormant in her man, because think about how the modern woman, due to society, right, a lot of societal expectations, is not only the wife and the mother, but also, is working and, building a career and kind of, has to like manage the household and control things. And like, she is very easily, due to like demands of society, pulled out of that feminine state.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that, that's another thing to look at when we're talking about perceptual resolutions, or, transcendent resolutions, is how am I embodying, conflicts that maybe aren't even mine, but like from society, or how, I guess, how is that impacting my conflicts? Because I know I work with a lot of mothers who have, what is a conflict? It's this split energy, right? Like a push pull, like I want it, but I don't. Like there's this conflicted energy. And I see so many women that, perhaps they're a stay-at-home mom, but then they feel like, oh, but I don't, like, I'm less than, like, I'm less of a woman for not having a job and not doing it all,
Mm,
and not maintaining
Right.
a, vibrant social life. And so I feel bad about it, or vice versa. A woman who does maybe have a job outside the home and then feels bad that, oh, but I'm not as much of a woman because I'm not, staying at home, raising my child, like, but women on both sides in either situation, where's the conflict? Is it in the reality of their situation, or is it their perception of it and the feeling that push pull from, like, from largely from demands of family, society, listening to what other people like are saying they should or shouldn't do. And I think a lot of women really internalize that. And that's part of or certainly can be part of the content of the conflict, or of several conflicts.
100%. 100%. Yeah. It gets so deep when you know this work well. And that's
Yeah.
also why I think it's so important for women to understand this work, right? So even when we get into the amygdala, right? So this is why community is so crucial for women, even from the biological perspective. So the amygdala is the response area in the brain that fires up when we get into fight or flight. So when the female's amygdala is triggered, so when she is in a threatening situation and she needs to enter fight or flight mode, she has a biological response that ensures that she will look for protection within community. So she
mm,
will look for who's going to protect me and who's going to protect my children, right? And she can also think when the amygdala is activated. And I think this is a really important aspect of women's biology because if we're alone, if we don't have that community who sees us, who honors the mothers that we are, right? Who honors our role in the home or honors our service to society, right? It is detrimental to the health of women for that not to be honored from the get-go. And for us to live in isolation is not helpful. So relationships are key, and it's important for us to cultivate sacred relationships. There's been studies done on how detrimental isolation is, like worse than smoking. Yeah, well, for the woman, I would argue even more so because she looks for protection in community. So she needs others to help her, right? Uh, on the opposing side, the man, when his amygdala is activated, he defends himself. So his amygdala triggers him immediately into aggression. So he can defend the territory, and he has no ability to think when the amygdala is activated. That's why sometimes when we maybe get into a fight with our partner, it turns a little nasty because he has the biological response to immediately jump into aggression, right? But when we understand that nature as women, we understand how important it is to cultivate relationships. And even when, we're awake, so to speak, although I don't really like that word, like awake, I'm awake, I get it, I know what's going on in the world. I would say maybe when we're aware as women of nature and to live in harmony with nature, it's so critical for us to surround ourselves in communities with others who are like-minded, who can be there for us and support us on that journey, right? And so that's the beauty of like what we're all doing today, right? And what you're doing in your podcast today. We're creating communities and we're getting the word out there on our platforms to create more safety, because in congruence with the sort of amygdala, like I was talking about, there's another biological component, which is like kidney collecting tubules, we call, which is
yeah.
abandonment, isolation, it's called also the refugee existence conflict. So I'm a refugee. My tribe has left me. I have nobody. I have to fend for myself. So what's the biological response? How does the body adapt? Is it begins to retain water. I must hold on to my resources because I need to fend for myself. Yeah. So how many women have this? So many women, and it's the allopathic diagnosis of bloating or water retention, right? So that's associated with the cycle a lot, or menopause. By the way, we didn't get into menopause so much, but the biological age for menopause for the right-hander is 51 and for the left-hander is 53. So we can use that biological age to determine conflicts. My mother's very vocal about her experience going through menopause at 42, right? So very, very early. But if we look at what we were talking about with the cycle, right? So the delayed menarche is that sexual conflict. Likewise, the absence of menstruation, so amenorrhea, if we go through a couple months where we don't get our period, sexual conflict. Now, again, if the sexual conflict for the female is so intense, she might have early onset of menopause. And my mom knew this work. So she was going through a very nasty divorce, very nasty trials and tribulations in her relationships that was creating sexual conflicts. So for her, was it a safe environment to give life and procreate? No. And actually, she saw her early onset of menopause as a gift. And she didn't worry about it because she totally understood the biological adaptation of why it was happening for her. Yeah. So it's interesting when we know this really, really, really well, we can really examine ourselves. And I would say as women, yeah, it's your obligation to take radical responsibility for your health. And it's your duty to learn about this work and to take it one step further and carry it on to your next generation.
Yeah, totally. I did want to add or ask one more thing about the KCT.
Yeah.
So especially in conjunction with the ovarian program and having ovarian cysts, how does the KCT make things worse for someone who has this conflict?
Yeah, well, it makes it worse for anybody with anything. Yeah. So water retention will always intensify a symptom, even beyond just the ovarian conflict, right? And it's so interesting because even when you examine people in the hospital, right? Or I always examine my grandparents in the elderly homes, they start to hang on to water, and it makes every symptom in the body even more uncomfortable. So it's important to note that, yeah, when you're experiencing any kind of symptom, observe whether you have the KCT because it kind of makes everything like extra uncomfortable, extra juicy. But there's something beautiful I learned in studying the ancestors, because I studied with the abuelas in Atitlan about the temazcal. And I think there's something so interesting between what I know about KCT and the temazcal, because the temazcal operates like a sauna. So it's clay built in the shape of a dome-like structure that is symbolically representing the womb.
Yep.
And when you're going in there as women, they're making it really hot. So you're sweating it all out and you're going back into the mother, right? So that isolation, abandonment, like who's the first person that usually abandons you? Your mother, right? So when you go back into the womb, and what are they having you do? They're having you ask for forgiveness. And you
Yep.
have to say the name of every male partner you were ever intimate with. And you have to say the name of every mother in your lineage, every female in your lineage. And you have to ask for forgiveness for maybe any children you lost or any children you terminated, right? And so you're actually resolving this. And even if you think about from terms of the two-phase program, right? The heat is bringing you back into conflict activity, so to speak. So I resolved so much of my KCT programs through that work. I was like, wow, I really lost a lot of weight and shed that. And I remember when that comes up for me, usually for me, it's like when I'm in a new environment, if I've traveled a lot and then all of a sudden I come back home, for some reason, home is a track for me. Coming home to my family causes some KCT abandonment. That's okay. We've all felt a little abandoned by our family, right? So, when I'm aware, I sometimes do those rituals and practices again, where I even if I don't have the external temazcal, I really sit in meditation and imagine that womb, and I ask for forgiveness, and I go through my ancestors, and I go through where I'm feeling abandoned, and that really, really, really helps. Yeah. Do
That's
you have
great.
anything to add on KCT? Because I know that's such a big one.
I mean, I've done a workshop on it and had a lot of personal resolution, especially in the last couple of months. It's been quite fascinating. And as I was sharing with Abigail in one of our many voice messages, that I realized for myself personally that I was using a lot of relationships and situations as opportunities to feel abandoned without realizing it. Like, so I was doing this unconsciously, like all the time. And um, I've been doing this nutrition and weight training program the last few months. And so I've been taking my weight on the scale every day. And so I've been trending down for the phase I'm in. And this was last month because it was right before my KCT workshop that I was hosting. And I went up by 2 pounds. And I had been, walking more, eating less. Like I was trending down like every day. And then I just like bumped up. And my hands were so swollen and my feet were so swollen I could barely put my shoes on. And I was like, like what is this? Like obviously I know it's KCT, but like what is this about? And I looked back from the previous day, and a couple of my good friends in Austin, I had invited them to some events in the next few weeks, and they both had other plans because they have full lives too. And that for me was enough to trigger that abandonment conflict. Like, oh, you are abandoning me because you don't want to hang out with me, you don't want to spend time with me, and like you're choosing something else. And not only that, but there's also a flavor of then I'm not being invited to what you're going to. And so it's kind of like a double thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, this is fascinating. Like the
Yeah.
fact that nothing quote really happened. Like obviously I had a DHS, or it was some kind of track when I got those text messages, but it was so subtle and so in the big scheme of things not super traumatic, right? But because I've been tracking my weight, and then just paying attention to more symptoms and stuff, it was so obvious what it was. And I was like, oh my goodness, like this is so crazy how easily this can still be activated for me, even with these very small triggers that, nothing life threatening happened, like, just through my phone.
Yeah.
And so yeah, the KCT is just a fascinating conflict, and yeah, how it affects everything,
Yeah.
and just makes it more intense.
When I work KCT with a client through like really trying to move through this because it's also so prevalent. I'm really interested right now into also the work of family constellation. So that's Bert Hellinger, and a lot of GNM people are also doing family constellations. It's very much in alignment with what we already know within the 5 biological laws, which is maybe another reason why I like it. But in family constellations, your relationship with your mother is your relationship with life. And usually the mother is the first person to abandon you, right? Because even in GNM, we know the mother is the first territory. So
Yep.
oftentimes if we can explore that as well, that sort of nuance that they articulate so profoundly in family constellations is that when you come to this world as a baby, you have to draw in the attention of your mother. You have to cry for the attention of your mother so that she will nourish you from her breast in order for you to survive. So when you're a baby, biologically, you are demanding the attention of your mother, the nourishment of your mother for your survival. So that's why they say in constellations, the number one rule is relationship with your mother is the relationship with life. And the more you feel nourished by your mother, the more you feel nourished by life. And so when I work KCT and abandonment, I always kind of also work the mother because it's usually the first person to abandon you, right? So like, and this is how deep we can go when we understand GNM, because like, oh, we're like, oh, I know the conflict theme. And then I had this experience and it triggered that conflict theme and it started this adaptation. And then it's like, yeah, and you can go even one step further because like, why are you personally always triggered by that conflict theme, right? Like,
Yep.
why is
Yep.
that always a trigger for you? Like I run skin programs so much. So it's like separation is a big theme for me in my life. So I really do the work to examine that from an even more deeper perspective so I can better integrate it into my life.
Yeah, exactly. And my
Yeah.
mom had a kidney infection when she was pregnant with me.
Oh, there you go, right? Yeah.
So I'm like, well, right off the bat, there it
Yeah.
is,
And
KCT.
it's like that interesting thing is like, what's the first conflict we will ever go through? Do you know? All of us.
I mean, birth.
Every being on this on in the womb will go through this first conflict.
I mean, being separated from the womb.
Even before that, it's was I wanted? Did mom go,
Oh, yeah.
yay, I'm pregnant? Or did she go, oh my God, I'm pregnant? Right? It's the
Yeah.
thing. It's was I wanted, right? And everything in Germany medicine is self-devaluation, the self-devaluation of a separation, the self-devaluation of a territorial loss, the self-devaluation of a lost conflict, right? So we go through all these things, but it's all rooted in that. And I think sometimes that's the most interesting one. It's like, knowing that information and also us as future mothers maybe also keeping that in mind as we go into conscious conception that we know through GNM anytime a baby is born with something it's because they experience that conflict in utero, so it's important to be aware of that first one. Am I wanted? Yeah.
Totally. And I was, just talking with a client today about, when we try to find the initial conflict shock or the underlying conflict for any symptom, literally any symptom, you always have to look at, okay, well, what has been shaping your perception since conception? The influence of the parents, the family, the school, the religion, everything, friendships, what have you. And it sets you up to experience certain types of conflicts. So that's why we're looking at, okay, from the time you were conceived and the time you were born and growing up, what was going on in your life that was maybe not the conflict itself related to the symptom you're now dealing with. Like maybe that conflict happened when you were a teenager or in college, but looking at the time before that, what was priming your perception to set you up to experience that conflict? Or, for example, if a woman is cheated on, one woman might experience that as some sort of territorial conflict or an indigestible morsel conflict or a separation conflict or a self-devaluation conflict. Why would one person experience it as one thing versus another? And so I think that that's also, a really important thing to look at is your belief system. About yourself and the world around you and about health and, everything about your family, who, how you were raised, what the perception of your parents is like, what health issues are maybe they experiencing now. That can tell you a lot about, their perception of the world around them, of course. And so,
Right.
yeah, I think that it's always really good to look back, before just the initial conflict shock that maybe caused the adaptation you're currently dealing with.
Yeah.
But also to add on to what both you and Ashlee were discussing about the KCT program, I also find that, I mean, obviously the abandonment piece of that is really big. And for a lot of people, that is, a big part of how it starts out. but also from, from some clients that I've worked with and stuff, I think that the existence piece of that is also really, and the refugee component, the other two components besides just abandonment, especially in terms of ideology. So I know a lot of people that I talk to that, are maybe more in the holistic space and then have found GNM because we're so outside of like societal norms. It can make it really challenging to connect with people in your life, perhaps people you meet in the real world. And there's this very large sense of like, I don't fit in, like my beliefs are so fundamentally different. I don't feel maybe even safe sharing a lot of my beliefs with people, in my life because it's so far outside the mainstream. And so I know that at least for me, that's definitely a thing that comes up is like, oh, I don't belong. I don't fit in
Yeah, don't
here. I
belong.
feel, this existential conflict of like, who am I? What are my beliefs about the world around me? Is it safe for me to believe that? Can I still have community? Which I think is why, even this podcast, right? Helping people feel less alone that maybe do share some of these same, beliefs about health in the body.
1,000%. And I think that's a really good point because with everything that's gone on in our modern day history these few years, I think a lot of people are feeling that abandonment and where do I fit in my community and how do I find my tribe? So I think for any woman out there today, that's really, really crucial in our health is to also just surround ourselves with our tribe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
to practice being unapologetically yourself. And by doing that, you are going to find the people that resonate. But what's interesting about the KCT is that if someone has an active abandonment conflict, then there's usually some type of behavior of trying to fit in and maybe modification of their personality or how they show up. And then that can create more KCT conflicts because you're showing up, but you're trying so hard to fit in and belong that you're actually not being yourself. And so you're, quote, fitting in, but you're fitting in because you're trying to be something you're not. And then that can perpetuate the KCT program as well, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
And so practice being yourself. And even within the GNM world, there's not a lot of us in the big scheme of things, but there are enough of us that creating that community and that space of safety to do things together and have these discussions and to live life with more people who know this information. It's very empowering.
Yeah, for sure. And also just circling back to something that we were talking about earlier that I just wanted to clarify for listeners, because I feel like this is so it's so radically different than what we're used to hearing societally about, femininity and all these different female related conflicts. And I know we were talking about different sexual territorial conflicts, like for example, sexual frustration or procreation conflict that might be experienced when a female is quite young. And so again, just to clarify for the listener, how might a young girl who is, biologically not able at that age to reproduce and actually find, a mate to have children with and actually procreate, how is she, say, if she's 5 or 6 years old, how would she experience perhaps a sexual frustration conflict? And why would that, why in her psyche would she even be able to experience that conflict since she's not at the age where she can reproduce?
Right. So I gave that example when I was talking about the cervix before of it being noted in the brain scans that were taken of fatherless females, right? So if we look at just the function of the cervix, so take the individual out of it and look at the biological function of the cervix, it's still to facilitate implantation, right? It's to facilitate the sperm to travel up to the egg to fertilize and procreate. So it's still in alignment with that procreation conflict, when we as a female are not protected in nature. So if we look at the biological system of the family, it's like a holy trinity. The father protects and provides for the mother, and he would die for her. She might not die for him, but she protects and provides for her children, and she would die for them. So it's always to ensure the survival of the offspring. So even for the female, her biology is still designed to help her procreate. So when there's a conflict in nature, the solution is still procreation. So if there is a family clan where there is a vulnerable female who's now not protected by the father, it's still a sexual frustration or a procreational conflict. It still can be interpreted that way. And I'd also like to point out, we still could know more about this, right? Because we're still taking brain scans. This is still being observed, right? So we certainly cannot say 100%, but we have observed the phenomenon. So one needs to consider why.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 Does that help further expand on that?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think also really with any conflict in general, I think it's always helpful to zoom out a bit and see like the overall kind of overarching message here, like in the underlying conflict theme. And I know that we can get way more specific, like, you know, what you were saying with different organs and specific nuances or flavors of these sexual territorial conflicts. But from what I know about GNM and from everything you've been saying, I think that the main theme with kind of female related conflicts and therefore symptoms with the reproductive organs, with our cycles, right, with all these different programs that are unique to females, but then also this would be mirrored in reproductive organs for males, right? It's about reproduction, and it's about, specifically for the female ones, feeling safe with the masculine, like being protected and provided for, and feeling safe to be in your femininity. Is kind of what I hear you saying. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And it's very primal, right? So studying our biology and studying it through this lens is really about understanding the primal nature of who we are. And that I think is really important to note. And I think it's also really cool to observe because we know through our consciousness, right? Like, I'm sure a lot of the listeners that listen to this podcast consider themselves to be conscious people out there in the world today, or critical thinkers, so to speak. So there is something to be said that when we become more conscious, when we live with more awareness, we have less symptoms, right? So like, even allopathic medicine says, like, when we have less stress, when we meditate, when we have mindfulness practices, right? But it's almost true even through our lens of biology, because yes, our biology is working on a primal aspect that's in alignment with, the roots of our ancestors and primal natural beings like the animal kingdom, right? But our conscious awareness, right, still is so, so crucial and so, so important, because I learned this work through my living experience, through living in a home where this was incorporated and integrated into my understanding of life and who I am in life. And I've noticed as German New Medicine has started to become in the forefront in the holistic world or the truther community, and it's first of all, for my mother and I, it's so incredible to witness this with something that you've been talking about for so long is finally being talked about and finally being acknowledged. It's amazing. I think one of the things I can observe from the outside is people have taken this information and now become like hypochondriacs about it. Like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna get a conflict and I need to know this. And like it's interesting to observe it being taken in this way, because to me, when you know it well, it seems so logical. It seems like, yeah, your body is designed that way. Like, duh, procreation it ensures the survival of the species, right? So sometimes I take that lens of the world for granted because I didn't have to sort of like unlearn a societal conventional norm. I just kind of looked at it like nature, like, yeah, that makes sense in nature that my body's gonna do whatever it can to survive and procreate. Yeah, that makes sense to me, right? So
Yeah.
it's important to acknowledge that as you're learning this, it's not to be taken for you now to freak out about every little symptom or freak out, oh, will I interpret that as a conflict? Or am I going to go through this experience now? Or, oh, I didn't get my period at 11. Like, no, I always say to people, this work is not to become superhuman, but to understand that being human is super.
Love that.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
So with GNM, I feel like something that often comes up a lot is that people use this beautiful knowledge to start playing the blame game, because they're the first to be like, oh yeah, I have this conflict because of my dad, because my mom, and my parents got divorced when I was this age. And that might be a very real part of course, why you initially experienced that conflict. I'm not denying that. But a lot of the times people get stuck with chronic symptoms and they use GNM to say, okay, what's the conflict here? They go back, they find out, okay, this was, likely the initial conflict shock that started this adaptation in my body. And then they kind of get a bit stuck there because, and again, with this podcast, Ashlee and I are all about promoting your greatest possible personal power and personal
Right.
freedom, which can only be accessed through a radical personal responsibility. So, through that lens, how can, because I can easily see a lot of women listening to this and being like, well, if only my partner were more like this, more of a man, if only he if only he had a better job to better provide for me, or, if only I could find a man, this would solve all my problems, or if only my dad had been there for me and, protect whatever. You can see how we can easily kind of fall into the blame game, especially with, different partners, like so-and-so cheated on me and this was a bad partner and blah, blah, blah. Like, so I guess what's your take on that? Like, how can we move towards resolution of these, sexual territorial conflicts and heal our relationship with the masculine to live our most free and liberated lives and really embrace our femininity, whatever we want that to look like as individuals with our freedom, of course. But, I guess, yeah, what's your take on that? How to kind of avoid the blame game in this process?
Right. So my take on that is, if we're still playing the blame game, we're not really living in alignment with the adaptive nature of the body. So if we look at everything as its primal truth, right? That means that procreation, it's for my next generation. So if we look at the biological specimen as an adaptive being, it means that every time I run an adaptation, it's so that I can be better than before, right? Ideally, I would experience a conflict, the organ would adapt, and when the organ finishes the two-phase program, it's regenerated and replenished and restored and better than it was in the first place. Yeah. So I'm a stronger being, not only physiologically, but also psychologically, because I overcame the obstacle that I went through. So now, if I look at my ancestral duty, right? And we even know this as a profound truth that I do everything for 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. Well, this actually, when we examine it, it has a very biological meaning too, which is that when I adapt something in my body, so when I experience something and my body adapts and overcomes it and becomes better than it was before I had experienced the conflict in the first place, I actually just did that for the generations to come. ideally, right? Like when you think about the adaptive nature of it, right? Each generation should be healthier than the one that came before it, because that ensures survival of the species. So if I look at my biology through its adaptive lens, then I know I have to take responsibility and radical responsibility, because it means that every time I overcome something, I've helped my next generation, because I've adapted my biology to overcome it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even if you just look at like freckles and GNM and say like there's got to be something to why certain that runs in the family of certain generations, right? When we know the adaptation of freckles to better protect ourselves, right? So it's interesting, like when we think about things through the true lens of adaptation, then we realize that like every symptom is truly a gift. And when I overcome a symptom, I am honoring the next generation as well, because I'm creating adaptations that will better help them, right? Like if I look at my beautiful brown skin from my father's Northern Indian heritage, I can say that is a beautiful adaptation of melanin that helped my father's lineage to survive in higher temperatures and, in higher proximity to the sun, right? Isn't as a biological adaptation. It is beautiful. And the next generation gets it too, right? So if we can look at every biological symptom that way, then we stop playing the blame game, because then we actually see it as, oh, this is like
It's a
my
gift.
duty. This is my
Yeah.
gift to
Yeah.
overcome it. And I also say, like, you also give yourself grace, because you also understand that if I'm looking at it as a gift, this could take time. Even me, I've had symptoms that have lasted for years, like rosacea. I don't have it anymore, but I had it for about like 3 or 4 years. So I knew exactly what it was. um, and I let it be my gift for a very long time. Yeah. And then at some point in my conscious awareness, it wasn't relevant to me anymore. But sometimes people will harp on things so intensely. And I just want to say to them, why do you want to get rid of it? But why? It's working for you perfectly, you know? And sometimes people stress about like the tiny minutia of it. Like, oh, well, I just really can't understand, why I have this terrible cold and it just doesn't seem to be going away. And I need to get back to work and I need. Well, your biology doesn't care about what the ego needs, It
Yeah.
doesn't care about that. If I
Not at all.
Yeah, if I'm in, I like to use the analogy of ceremony, because this is my flyer postmortal constellation coming in, but I like to use the analogy of, if I sit in ceremony like my ancestors did, and I drink the psilocybin or I drink the ayahuasca to commune with what I still need to learn about myself, what awareness still needs to come forth. I can't drink it and then go, oh, never mind, turn it off. Like I want to, I don't know, it's like too late. You're in it. Now you
Yep.
need to know what message it has for you. You can't just get out of there. There's no
Yeah.
going back. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And likewise, I say to people, you'll also come to the point of no return within your threshold of knowing this work, where you're like, gosh, I just know too many things. I'm not going back. It's way
Yep.
too much of a risk for me to go back to that person than it is for me to embody this one. I
Yep.
just know what I know. And now I don't even need to convince others of it.
Yep.
I was just listening to Steve, Dr. Melissa Sell's partner, and he said, truth should exude from you like a pheromone. It's not for you to convince others what your truth is or how to live their lives or what they should do. It's you should be embodied and in alignment with your truth so distinctly that it just exudes and emanates from you like a pheromone that you give off. You should know it and live it so well that it just is a part of you. Isn't that so beautiful?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
beautiful. And I think about how many conflicts would be eliminated if people allowed that to be true for them, instead of like needing other people to believe them, or like needing, you know, other people to like be on the same page with everything. Like, I mean, I can see why that biologically, you know, why that those conflicts could happen, of course, but I think that that's a really beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
So thank you, Natasha. This has been such an amazing conversation. And I just want all of our listeners to know that we brought up so many different topics today that we will be doing future, more in-depth episodes on. So if you feel like, whoa, there was a lot out there, and what about infertility? What about the causes of miscarriage? What about, you know, the different programs involved with different issues during pregnancy and birth, and all of that, and more into the different female related conflicts. We are going to be doing specific episodes on all those things. So stay tuned, because we will be covering that more in depth. We're also going to do a whole series, if you will, on constellations. So that's also coming. If you're like, what the heck were you talking about with like, what's a constellation and what are they talking about? Don't worry, we're going to do like really like beginner friendly episodes on, well, one in particular on intro to constellations. And then we're going to do a few different episodes on different constellations specifically. And then we're also going to do an episode on menopause, and then one on just KCT, the kidney collecting tubules program. So just wanted to let everyone know, in case you're feeling a little like overwhelmed, like, whoa, like this is a lot of information and I want to dive in more and I'm curious. We have all of that coming. So stay tuned. But yes, Natasha, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your own you know, knowledge of GNM and just the wisdom that comes innately through growing up with this knowledge, which you're actually the only person I know that's like you know, kind of my same age that has actually grown up with this being their dominant paradigm, right? And that is such a gift. I
And I
actually,
won't be the last. I know
right? Yeah,
that.
you won't be the last
So
for
many
sure.
babies coming forth that will grow up this way too.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes.
And I know that Ashlee and I got to meet you in person this past year, as well as your lovely mother, who was just a joy to be around. So anyway, thank you so much for coming on. And
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
we hope you enjoyed today's conversation. We appreciate you being here.
If you would like some additional support in navigating your health symptoms, we both provide coaching services from a German New Medicine perspective.
Our Instagram handles and personal websites are linked in the podcast description.